All right, all right, all right. Welcome to this 28, not 7, 28 edition of the Warrior Week Parables from the Pit. This is a very and unique episode. As you can see, I have a female guest inside of the studio. This is the first time we ever had a female guest inside of the studio by herself, talking about the parables from the pit. We're going to figure out who this woman is. We're going to figure out why she's qualified to be sitting. She's the only woman qualified to be sitting inside of this conversation. Prior to her, we had a family that was here, but that was very different, and conversation was very different. She is the only woman that is qualified to be sitting here today. There may be others after her, but she's the one that is going to start a movement and an evolution inside of the feminine world as we get to talk about the parables from the pit. Sit down and enjoy this episode. All right, before we start introducing you, I'm going to tell you a story. And the story is that this morning I came into the office and I got kind of too triggered. I got triggered because, there was a podcast going on and there was this guy called Jeff McGregor that was talking loud. So then I got pissed off and I yelled at him, "Jeff, stop fucking talking!" And it appears that Jeff is no longer talking in the background. So that was the story. This was a live story that took place today. So I hope you enjoyed that. The lesson that came from that is no one is your friend, not even Jeff. Okay. Welcome to the studio, Natalie.
Thank you. I'm honored.
You have been a big part of the Warrior movement. You're the one that has put in on ink the content of Warrior Book, written by Garrett, but you're the one that put it on ink. You're the one that structured the book. There is a section that you created also inside of the book. So we're going to talk about that, Warrior Book, and your involvement here inside of the game for the past 2 years.
Three.
For the past 3 years, and how you've actually contributed and how many of men you've seen grown, including your own husband that came in through Warrior Weeks, graduate of Warrior Weeks, and as well as a conversation that's going to take us to a place that we have not been. We're going to go to your pit. We're going to go to the pit of our wives. We're going to go to the pit of our women, and that is a place that we, as a whole, have not yet gone. We've all have gone to our own pit, and inside of that, parables from the pit came out, and we've told the story, and we continue to tell the story. But this is the first opportunity for us to get a glance of your pit, which is a glance of our wife's pit, which is a glance of the woman's pit on the feminine side. So before getting there, just talk to me a little bit about how you found Warrior, and as you started initially to work with Warrior, how did that started changing your way of thinking? If not changing it, how did it start complementing the way that you were already thinking?
So I didn't find Warrior. Warrior found me. I was doing podcast show notes for a nonprofit pro bono, and as Garrett was putting together Warrior on Fire, he needed somebody to write show notes, and my name got mentioned, and I was told that I most likely would be communicating with Jeremy Finlay more often than not, and he's the one that kind of trained me in a lot of the different aspects of the background work behind Warrior, but ultimately it came down to a lot more work than I initially thought. I thought I would just be writing show notes for a podcast, and through a lot of evolutions throughout each month, Garrett would give me an assignment, I would do it, and he'd give me another assignment, I'd do it, and it led to more involvement with the actual program itself, all on the back end. So from yearbooks to Warrior Week, paperwork, and various aspects. That was all in 2015, and then towards
So let's roll back
Okay.
before we move too forward. Let's figure out a little bit about your background, right?
Okay.
Your background, kids, husband, married, religious background. Like just paint the story
Okay.
of Natalie coming in to this conversation of warrior, right? So you were selected, you were found, and then obviously there was an attraction from that side that led you to be here for 3 years. But let's talk about the Natalie prior to warrior, and what port, if you want, or what window was open so that actually warrior can come in inside of your heart.
Oh, I love it. Okay. So I have 4 children, and I am a history and English certified secondary teacher and loved teaching, absolutely loved it. And when my husband and I found out that we were pregnant with our first, it was always something that we both wanted to have a parent stay at home with our children. And it was a very sacred experience where I was able to sacrifice my career teaching so that I could be home with our first child. It was hard, and I mean,
How old were you?
I was, oh gosh, you have to ask that. Let me think. 25, 26.
Okay, so 25, 26, you have your first child. What's the name of it?
Seth.
Seth. Okay, so Seth comes in, and Chris was a police officer then, or no?
No,
No,
not at that time.
So Chris was not a police officer.
No.
Okay, so then Seth comes in. You were a teacher.
Yes,
Okay, what were you teaching?
I was teaching computers.
Nice. I
but I'm history and
Macintosh.
English.
Macintosh.
No, they were PCs, and so my belly would throw in. I mean, these were the old school. This was 2005.
Windows.
2006, 2005, and so my belly would be like hitting the computer screens as I'd be talking to my middle school students.
Okay, so at that time you had to make the decision of not teaching anymore, which was something you were enjoying. Yeah, obviously you were getting paid for it as well. That's fine, but it was this concept of helping, teaching, serving. So that was taken away from you, and there you are in exchange, spending time with your kids,
with a very small dictator that
Seth.
Seth. He was an absolute porker. He would eat for an hour and 45 minutes and then sleep for an hour and 45
So
minutes.
then, nice move, Seth. So then, how did you feel as a woman right then? Like, I want to capture the feeling.
So it's really interesting that you mentioned the feeling behind it, because I was raised by a mother that stayed at home as well. And it was actually a conversation that she had with me that it came from a place of love, but it was also this feeling of guilt that came along with it of, if I'm not there for my children, there's only one opportunity that I will have to raise my children. I made that decision, but the way how she approached it was in tackling that fear, tackling that pain of, what if you have your children grown up and you didn't get a chance to raise them yourself as children, as babies. And so even though it kind of came from this place of shame, what led me to become a stay-at-home mom was truly out of a place of love. I knew that I would only have that one time to raise my children, and I could still keep my certification up for teaching, go and I did substitute teaching because I missed it so much, but my children have always been my first priority. They're my greatest accomplishment.
So you felt guilt.
Yes.
And then did you ever went back?
Yes.
How many years back?
Well, I did the substitute teaching for about 2 or 3 years, and then by that time I had 2 or 3 more children. And then with the pregnancy of my 4th child, we were in a tough place. Chris was a police officer by this time, and in Idaho they do not pay police officers very well, especially small agencies.
Yes, we know that.
So
let it be said, let it be told that in Idaho, the police officers that are currently in Idaho serving and risking their fucking lives are actually paid 3 times less than the state of fucking New York. Same risk, same family, 4 kids, wife, same fucking criminals, same situation, same service. Let it be known that the men in Idaho are paid 3 times fucking less. Some may argument, oh, well, the cost of living in Idaho is not fuck you. This has nothing to do with the cost of living. This has to do with the decision of man putting his life in line for your ass, serving you and your family so you can sleep at peace at night. That is what this is about. But nobody gives a fuck about this shit. No one gives a shit about this side of it. 3 times less a man is paid in a different state for the same fucking risk. That has always fucking bothered me, continues to bother me. And I had discussions with Chris as well, your husband, about this. Mm-hmm. And as a result of it, Chris is no longer a police officer, not because he doesn't want to serve, not because of the money, but because life created the condition and the environment for him to find a path and a purpose in service that is above and beyond just being boxed in a little box and being told what the fuck to do and risking his family. So we're talking about Chris and where he's at today and his purpose and what he wants. But coming back at you, so you had guilt. Mm-hmm. You dealt with this guilt a little bit. You came back to work.
Well, and I was ashamed too. Like we were to the point we had Medicaid. We had to get food stamps because he got paid so little. And yet we still weren't able to pay our bills. You know, just very basic bills. We didn't have we had a small little cottage that for our home. The kids shared bedrooms and everything, and our kids were wonderful. They were happy, and I love making homemade meals and everything. But when you can't pay a bill, you can't pay a bill. So I was in that state of can't.
Yes.
That I was looking at everything that we can't do. We couldn't go on family vacations and everything else, and so. I have a sign that is from World War II that says "We can do it," and it's Rosie the Riveter. You know, she has her arm up. In fact, I have a little pin right here.
Nice.
For it that she says, you know, we can do it. And when I looked at that sign, I looked at the word "can," and that stood out to me so much that I realized that I begin to look at life from the perspective of what does it mean if I were to look at something saying "can." And so that's when I realized, well, I'm still certified, so I can look into online teaching. The technology is such that online teaching is possible. I actually homeschooled our oldest, Seth, the porker, when he was a baby, and he still kind of is a porker. Mm-hmm. And I homeschooled him, and he did online teaching through K-12. And I looked into that a little bit more and found a position for a social studies teacher that taught 6th and 7th graders. And while I was pregnant and then having my 4th, I was teaching students. So while I was nursing him, I could be on a conference call with a student, just have the camera off. And it wasn't ideal because I really liked that interaction between my students, but I still was able to. So
you were left with living with the pain of can't for how many years?
Oh, a decade.
Okay. The pain of can't, right? Just, you can imagine, because you lived it. How much of it you put it inside of you? How much of it was actually put outside and shared with Chris?
Oh, it was definitely a reflection towards him too. He felt that he was making a contribution to society to protect and serve as a police officer, and yet here was his own family. He actually didn't know that we were on Medicaid and that we had food stamps. Because I didn't tell him, I didn't want to.
So that's exactly my point. So for 10 years, the pain of can't, right? This pain.
Right.
Where was this stuff?
What do you mean?
Where did you put it? Inside of you? Like you felt the pain.
Oh, very.
Yeah. Where the fuck this pain went?
I'm a very emotional person, and so I would go into rage mode, like the full-on Hulk, anxiety attacks, very severe anxiety actually, and I would blow up over just the littlest thing. You know, one of my kids unbuckling their seatbelt in the car as we're driving or something, and like, why are you unbuckling your seatbelt? That's not safe. And so it ended up becoming this empty shell where I would project out that frustration, but I wouldn't actually get to the bottom of it. So it made me feel emptier and emptier until I call it empty shell syndrome, where it was all about Chris. It was all about the kids. My primary love language is gifts of service, acts of service. And so I naturally leaned towards providing service for other people. And it hadn't occurred to me, because everything was all about everybody else, that I also need service.
Yes.
And it was really hard for me to, like, that's something as a police wife, they tell you right at the beginning, you have to learn how to become a single parent. You have to learn how to do pretty much everything on your own. He is not going to be there for every holiday. He's not going to be there for every birthday party. It's just not possible. And so again, that he can't be there. And so I realized, like, okay, well, I just have to step it up. I have to step it up. If I keep doing this and keep helping Chris in this way because I'm sacrificing for the sake of the children, then everything will come out in the right. Everything will come out in the end somehow. But it wasn't until I started taking on that mentality of can and started to tackle things.
So
on
so
my
the
own.
pit your pit
Mm-hmm.
keep becoming deeper and wider because of the series of can't that would contribute to it. By far the biggest would be can't even be with my husband because hours of work
Oh, he was
takes
always gone.
him away. And what about the worry and anxiety that Chris may never come home, right? Because he
Yeah.
may go in an operation and tomorrow
Well,
he
see,
won't
and
be there.
And that's the thing. He would keep all of that from us as well. It wouldn't be until like months later when I'd hear about some drug sting or, for instance, he grew out his goatee really long at one point, and I didn't know it until months afterwards that he was working narcotics during that time, and would go to a different town and be a scumbag and then come home and try to like smooth down the goatee and then try to operate as a father to his children. He didn't have an example of a father growing up. And so he was trying to do the best that he could, but he wasn't telling me anything. And so our communication just became absolute shit.
Yeah.
We had no communication.
What about the worry and anxiety of Chris not coming home? Like you sitting in your room where the kids are sleeping and then they're like, just the danger of the fucking mission.
I didn't really feel that actually as much as I thought. Well, first off, so he was a police officer. The whole mentality behind my mind was that, oh, well, we're in a small town. Nothing happens in this small town. I grew up in this town because, I mean, I'm a bookworm. My kids could safely do anything that I did as a teenager, and I would be okay with that. Like, that's really how boring I truly am.
Got it.
I married the only boyfriend I ever had. Like, it really is just a boring kind of a story, which, for a parent is like, oh, that sounds ideal for my child. But when Chris became a police officer for our little town, I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. If he's to be a police officer somewhere, this is the place to be. Little did I know that, just as you said, it doesn't matter the demography of wherever anybody else. The same crime happens everywhere. It matches the population, and so we don't hear about it as much. And plus, it's a small town. Everybody's in everybody else's business. They cover up things. They hide things. Suicides are actually quite high, but when you'd look at an obituary, they would say that they passed away in their home over natural causes or something along those lines, that he would have to deal with deaths that nobody would even admit had happened. He'd have to deal with stabbings and with gunshots that nobody knew had occurred because it's a small town. Nothing happens in a small town. And, just a few months into him being a police officer, he had to kick down a door for a huge meth lab and got terribly sick afterwards. But I didn't know that it was a meth lab. He's just like, oh, I have a head cold. And so it was these lies that he would share out of safety for us.
Yes.
But it wasn't until later on that I realized how serious everything truly was. And it also led to health issues further on down the road for him as well.
So the one place that Chris will actually get peace, so the one place where he could actually have a peace of mind, that he could actually just disconnect, became a place where he had to fucking lie.
Yeah.
At home, he had to lie for the safety of the kids and for not making you worried, because there's already like, you're already dealing with the pressure of can't, and in so many ways, financially, can't even have your husband enough at home. And I can just imagine with 4 kids, how demanding that would be on you. And then
it was with 3 kids. It was at the 4th kid. That's when I changed that mentality to can.
Got it. So with the 3rd kid, and then inside of that, Chris would force to lie. Like conversations would be like, he'll come home and he'll begin with a lie. And it's not intentional lie, but it's that I call it the white lie, call it whatever the fuck it is, but it is a lie. And you run with that version of the lie. But deep down inside, there is part of you that kind of doesn't believe it, but really doesn't want to challenge it because It
well,
is
and
what
I was
it
so
is.
exhausted anyway. You know,
Yeah.
3 kids that he was put on the back burner. You know, and I hated I put myself on the back burner. He was put on the back burner. The kids were the focus.
Yes. So you come to the conversation of warrior,
Mhm.
and we're gonna get back to your pit, and just to understand from a woman's perspective, what contributes to your pit, right? Part of it has to do with you growing up as a kid.
Mhm.
Part of it has to do with the religious background and what or culture or ideology that's pushed on you.
Mhm.
Part of it has to do, a lot of it has to do with your marriage, because that's the environment that you live in the most. So the pit gets bigger and wider, right? But obviously the concept of pit wasn't really like painted for you the way Warrior painted it out.
Mhm.
You get to listen to Garrett's message for a while, and you get to hear this. Your heart opens up to this, and at one point comes in the project to put out the Warrior book, and
Mhm.
Garrett begins recording that, and you put it in ink and structure it. Talk to me about, as a woman, your feeling going through the content and putting it together, how you felt this is relative to you, your marriage, your husband, and as well as to what you have seen as the society, right? What you've
Okay.
seen, like your feeling about what this book could actually expose to a world that is full of lies.
I love that. All right. Well, the book is a masterpiece, and so it's my baby. I absolutely love everything about that book, even all of the pits that I had to go through to get it to where it was at, to become, where published. And with the book, it tackles a hero's journey, and that's what's beautiful about any hero's journey is anybody can relate to it. And of course, a heroine's journey is different, and we may touch up on that, we may not, but with it, I could see a mirror of the pain that I had in my own struggles. Obviously not like Garrett's, because those are Garrett's and my struggles are my own, but I could see the need to find an answer behind the pain, because otherwise what's the point? If we're just experiencing pain for pain's sake, there's no point to it. But if there's pain with a purpose, and then we can see some clarity behind it, it becomes more relevant, and it becomes a lesson to be learned to then teach to others, so that then they can have tools to go through because everybody's going to have their own pit. Everybody's going to have their own pain. And there's tools out there that can help them realize that there's a point to it all. And that's what the Warrior book was all about for me. While editing it, I was up so late doing various editings and works, and literally nobody has ever read the Warrior book as often as I have. That's just not possible. I have read the Warrior book front and backwards and everywhere else. And in so doing, it gave me a grasp of what it takes to understand. Like, we're all a book. If you look at that, we're all a book that has multiple chapters in it, and sometimes those chapters have to be cut out. Sometimes the chapters are expanded upon. But ultimately, when it comes down to the power of a story, of our own journey, everyone has something that we can relate to eventually. And so this is just the example of what everybody else does.
Let's talk about your story.
Okay.
As you're writing the chapter, the pit. What are you feeling? Talk about your pit as you're writing it. What are you recognizing? And here's an opportunity for you on this podcast to really share what your pit is, and as well as how as you're writing this and you're stopping and you're digging inside, because you have to fucking feel this in order to structure it the way you structure it. You didn't just do it like a robot. Every section was felt, and it was felt through your own experience, and that's why it was projected and mirrored back in the structure that it has right now. That's why the book is very unique, because it wasn't done by some dumbass editor or some editor that we don't even have connection or relationship. Like, you've been already inside of the game for a year and a half when the book came out, and you knew Garrett, you knew us, you knew the mission, you knew what we were standing for. So every single paragraph was felt and personalized from a structure and editing perspective. So let's go to the chapter of the pit specifically.
Okay.
And let's talk about your pit, like the pain and that you felt for years inside of your pit, and how that came about as you start like editing?
Okay. So my background is I'm LDS, I'm Mormon, and I have 5 brothers. I don't have any sisters. And so I've always kind of been in a household where the women have been told that they need to take care of men. That was just the way how we were raised. And my dad had all sisters, and he grew up on a farm, and they took care of all of that. And then he went into business, and so we were like the city slickers of the family. That we didn't do farm work, and yet I had all these brothers that didn't do housework either. They were taught that you don't have to take care of the house. It's a woman's job. You know, like if a guy asks for a glass of water, a woman needs to get it for him. And so at the age of 10, I still remember that my dad was so mad at me over something because I didn't answer his beck and call. And he said, "You're a feminist." And I had no clue what he was talking about. I'm 10. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. And he was getting even more mad at me, thinking I was being defiant and that I was being belligerent. And ultimately, it came down to my dad and I have very strong personalities, very similar. But he wasn't used to women not catering to him. And so he didn't beat me, but it was this feeling of worthlessness that as a very young child, that because I'm not a man, because I'm not a male, I am less. And so it was this constant feeling of needing to do more and never being able to do enough. And then you throw in the culture in society. So, you know, I already love to provide service. Like it's so much easier for me to provide service for others than to receive service myself. It's very hard for me to receive any help. And yet in the Mormon culture, women are always looking at ways that they can help other people by losing themselves in service, losing themselves in helping everybody else. And yet it's not really emphasized that you need to take care of yourself too. It's almost kind of like a glance to like, oh yeah, and make sure that you take care of yourself. Make sure that you read your scriptures. Make sure that you do your hair for your husband and everything else. It was very traditional, very Donna Reed. Like she was seriously somebody that I wanted to be when, like, my ideal picture of having a family while growing up, you know, as a teenager into going to college. I didn't actually go to college starting out to get a degree, unless it was an MRS degree to be married. Like I truly have always just wanted to be a mom, and it's the most incredible experience for me to still have. But I also realized in editing the Black Book, now Warrior Book, at the time, that I can be more and a mom. Like it hadn't occurred to me. I thought that in order to be a mom, I had to be all in. And be the Donna Reed, be the, you know, like just wearing the heels and the cute little apron, which those are cute. I love those. Mm-hmm. And I've always loved to be feminine. And so I figured, well, femininity is shown through taking care of the family, through housework, through providing service for others.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
What happens to your sexuality desires lost when you actually think that way, that femininity is just about taking care of the family? Like, what happens to your female charm? What happens to the desires of the sexual desires of a woman?
Oh, I hadn't really.
Because obviously I don't have the fucking answer, but the reality is, what happens to it? Does it get?
Well, so here's the thing. Chris is an amazing lover. Like he has made it all about me, and so that's been the strongest part of our marriage always. So I think that sex was never really an issue for me.
But you can imagine that the thousands of guys that I've spoken with, with the wife of your portfolio, exactly the way you fucking described, exactly, tick, 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 you know, go get a glass of water, whatever, right? Those ideologies.
I never did.
Good for you. But still, right, with the same ideologies. You can imagine that, like, life becomes disconnected. They don't have sex with their husbands. There is unspoken words because they keep and keep and keep the pain inside. And the guys continue to actually promote this relationship and train them to be disconnected. So there is this fucking unnecessarily gap that takes between two people that actually loved each other at the beginning and according to them still do, but they end up living like fucking roommates.
Yeah.
Like, and if you're somebody that's listening to this podcast right now, and this is exactly the case with you, where you've been married quite a while, you have kids, and you love your fucking wife, and you'll do anything for your wife and anything, right? But yet you feel like a roommate, meaning that there is nothing but responsibilities of the kids, logistics for the kids, conversation that takes place. Other than that, it's from here and there. Maybe you'll go out once in a while, but really there's no intimacy. Sexuality is not really high. There's no attraction that exists, and really you live in your own fucking bubbles. You may be downstairs drinking wine and being on your computer, and her may be upstairs reading a book and drinking wine, and then living in separate bubbles. And then maybe you'll meet at night to sleep. And if you're lucky, maybe sometimes you'll have sex. But I'm not pulling this out of my ass. This is the story of thousands and thousands of men that have come in through the interview, came into the process of Warrior Week, where they feel disconnected, right? Mm-hmm. And when they describe like the background of their wives, it's very similar to what you described here, which is, hey, kids, culture and environment.
It was
so
our
like
communication more than anything. Like I said, our sex life has always been great. Like that's on Chris actually, because I had good girl syndrome.
Good.
Where it was like, well, sex is for marriage and sex is for procreating children. Like, that's it. You're not supposed to enjoy yourself. You're not supposed to do all of these things for the husband, unless, of course, he asks for it and everything else. You're not supposed to masturbate. You're not supposed to do any of these things, very by the book.
Structured.
Oh, but make sure that you have lots of kids. And fortunately, Chris has always been really good at being patient with me, too, where it's been an evolution for our sex. So when we would go to therapy, that would always be kind of our foundation. That, well, why is sex still working? Why are you still able to have sex a couple of times a week? And even though your communication is absolute shit, even though you hardly see each other, how are you still able to get sex in? And so that always became like our glue. That and history.
Yes.
We love history. And so that was our glue to kind of keep us together, and it was because of Chris wanting me, like that was kind of almost like his fail-safe, where I can't communicate with you about work, but I can focus on making sure that you get an awesome orgasm. In fact, multiple ones, since women can have multiple. And so the more that he was reading up on it, because he loves to learn, the more he was reading up on it, the more he was able to kind of take away from the pain that he was feeling in other areas, such as feeling, that he could project that into sex and feel like, okay, well, that's where it needs to be.
What if sex wasn't there? What would you think would happen to your marriage?
We wouldn't be married. We wouldn't be married. That's like just a given. And at one point, when I discovered some lies that he had kept from me for years, by this time, some of our kids were going to play therapy, which is kind of like a child psychologist that takes it just in plain and can get answers and everything. And our oldest in particular, he was having a lot of anger issues and just a lot of anxiety and just behaviors that we went to professionals with help, and with Chris, he did not want to admit that he was the problem. Like, he's like, well, why? Like, and by this point, it was like, yes, you are the problem. If you would actually like treat us like not like criminals, and even though he would say, well, no, I'm not interrogating you like a criminal, but the way how we would feel would be that we were being interrogated. That any little thing that would happen, he'd blow up over, and so during this time, it got to the point that I wanted to be a roommate with him. I wanted to just like say, you know what, we'll be friends with benefits, that if we both feel like we need to have an orgasm or have sex, then we'll be there for each other. But other than that, we're here for the kids, and once the kids get old enough, I'm out of here.
How long did that last?
Let's see. He became a police officer in 2007, and that occurred in 2015. Probably, yeah, around the time that I started doing the podcast.
So how long did it last?
Of feeling like being roommates?
The whole thing.
Feeling like a roommate probably for about 2 years.
Okay, so you're 2 years.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about specifically that because that's probably the darkest and the deepest pit that was created somehow for you or with you. So talk to us, the audience, myself, and everybody else that has a penis listening to this podcast. Talk to us about a pit of an unhappy woman. What does that look like? The pit of an unhappy woman. And the pit is something that us as husband and as well as men in the relationship, we don't see. We don't see the pit of our wives because it's deep and wide and it's hidden. We barely can fucking see our own pit, and we have to go through the process of discovery and an inquiry to figure out what the fuck the pit is. I mean, this is the essence of this show. More men have come in here to share the parables from the pit where they came into this experience called Warrior Week, which forces a man to go in his pit and discover, holy shit, this is the fucking pit. This is my pit. There are no one all like it. This is my pit. There are no other pit like it. It's mine. And I'm going to find the light to come out of it, right? So that's the process that takes for men to go see our own pit. Not often. All the time. We have no fucking clue about the pit of our wives or our women. Unhappy, right? Because that's where it is. When you're happy, you don't really, like, the pit is filled up. Right? It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but happy times fill up the pit. So it kind of pretends that it's not there and paints the beautiful picture.
I was so busy with the kids that
fills it up.
It was actually in 2012. I know exactly. It was in January 2012 that I realized that I didn't feel anything for anybody. You know, the kids. Like everything was in motion. Like I was a robot. I was in motion, but and mostly because I didn't feel anything for me. I didn't know who I was, and other than a mom, and I felt like I was mediocre at that. And even though I would go through the motions, and the kids would still be, you know, fed and watered and put to bed at a decent hour and everything else, and hugged and snuggled, I didn't feel anything myself. I had gotten to the point of taking it to the extreme that as a police wife, you're single parent, as a woman that is in a culture it's all about everybody else, I didn't know who I was anymore.
So talk to us about like this concept of not knowing who you are, and what does a pit of an unhappy, confused wife looks like? Woman,
it's empty.
How does it look like? What are the feelings involved? Like, go into the fucking pit and describe to us for the first time ever, like, what a moment feels and goes through, so at least the audience, myself, and everybody with a penis listening to this podcast gets a fucking idea that what you guys actually feel. That is unspoken.
And see, that's the thing. It was like, I feel so much, but I was empty by this point, and that's why I called it empty shell syndrome. I felt like I was walking on eggshells all around Chris all the time. Even though he would blow up over the stupidest things, and then I would blow up over the stupidest things, and so the only emotion that I really felt anymore was anger and resentment. And so I realized that in not knowing who I was anymore, I needed to go on a journey of figuring that out. But I also had to break down walls.
Right in that place, what would have taken for you to leave Chris? What would have in that fucking dark place? What would have taken for you to leave? Meaning that. What if, like, how can you see yourself leaving Chris in that time? What other incident, event, or maybe another day, what would it take for you to say it's over? Because that's the part that is not understood on the other side. And I'm going to explain to you this. I'm going to allow you to answer this, and I'm going to explain to you why it's not fucking understood from the man's perspective. So tell me.
So in 2010, right after the birth of our third child, I left Chris with the 3 children because he blew up over something. I was watering the garden.
Yes.
We had just gotten back from the hospital.
Yes.
He's like, Natalie, you just got back from the hospital. Don't water the garden. And I blew up because I'm like, nobody else is going to water it. You won't water the garden. You don't even care. And by then I had had enough, and I had just brought this beautiful newborn into the world that I did not want to expose to this. In fact, he was the only pregnancy that we didn't plan out. He was meant to come. His name, Liam, means protector. And I was not going to expose him to that anymore. And so I left. And I took the kids. I grabbed like a diaper box with random diapers because at this time I had 2 in diapers, different sizes. And I was still, my milk was coming in. I was still bleeding from after having a vaginal birth. And we didn't have any hot water because we couldn't afford our water heater to be fixed. And so I took the kids to the park, not intending necessarily to be gone forever, but just to get to be away, to get away. And so I let the older kids play at the park while I was trying to nurse my youngest because I had a lot of breastfeeding issues from my first child that led to scarring. And so my third child had to reshape everything so that he could feed. And to this day, the greatest accomplishment is that I was able to feed my third and fourth children without a bottle. And that was like that was my foundation. That was like I can still be a mom. I can still be a mom to these kids, and even if it means being a mom by myself. But it was that I was getting lost in the experience of being a mom, and which then led to in 2012 the empty shell syndrome and healing that came with that 4th pregnancy during 2012. But during 2010, I had gone to my parents' house that lived just a few miles away so that my kids could get a bath in before going to bed, and with the intention, honestly, of going back home. And my mom saw me come in, and the kids just started playing, and she saw me feeding my youngest, and she said, well, where's Chris? And that's when I lost it. And it led to a lot of darkness in family involvement that made us realize that we are better together, and that what we truly wanted was to be there for each other, even if we couldn't share at that time the truth.
And that is exactly what happens to a marriage. That is exactly what happens to a beautiful relationship, which hits this auto cruise, right? And so I'm talking about from our perspective, and which is Chris' perspective, which is
Chris thought I was just hormonal.
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, I had a brother that was coming with me to, again, getting family involved is always a mess. That came with me to kind of grab some of the kids' stuff because my mom said, you know what, Natalie, if you feel like you need to be here for a bit, while you get things kind of sorted out, then that's what we need to do. It has
nothing to do with fucking hormones, and that's a story that we.
But that was the story that Chris expected.
But that's a story that I have adopted too, and that's a story that I had when my wife being pregnant with the second child, and like when she came back home, and a month after that, it's just like we put a fucking label on the problem, and we are told to do that. We are taught to do that. The reality is, go ahead.
My brother when I came home and I was grabbing everything, I'm crying, and I said, I'm not going to let Liam grow up with this. And so Chris is like, Natalie, because he's very logical, and up until Warrior X, that was the first time he cried. Warrior X was the first time he cried.
We're going to talk about that.
And he's like, Natalie, you're being emotional, and I think this is your hormones being out of whack. And I blew up, and my brother comes storming in, and he's like, that's my sister you're talking to. And Chris had no fucking clue why my brother would react the way that he did. And it was the pain, not being able to like put it into words, but just being able to, my brother wanted to defend his sister. He didn't know how. He didn't, he had a respect for Chris to a degree, but he didn't know how to stand up for his sister when he could see that I was so unhappy.
And precisely, that is exactly what is happening to every fucking relationship that has blown up because of the following. The formula is fucking simple. The formula is the following, and we just uncovered it here in this talk, is that the pain gets buried into the pit to a point where the pit explodes, and on the outside, we think of your explosion of the pit as some fucking story of hormonal or whatever, some logical definition behind why you exploded. Not knowing what your pit is, not knowing how deep, why, and how many years we've been actually filling it up with sand to pretend that it doesn't fucking exist. It blows up. In some cases, miracle happens, such as Liam, and they bring them back together.
And have you noticed that
in other cases, in other cases, miracles don't come.
Yeah.
And people divorce. The idea of this is the following. You ask yourself why a man and a woman leave each other. Men will not leave their woman. Men will not leave their woman. They're actually fucking loyal. But men have tendency to fucking cheat and lie with the insurance and assurance that their woman is there for life. So they get married 40, 50 years. They ask the woman to bring the bowl of water, and they get served, and they give themselves permission in that space to go actually visit other vaginas and other pussies. They do that. Most men would do that. Then on the other side, women will be with men. They will not leave the men until they find somebody else to leave the man for. Every single fucking divorce and separation that you see has somebody else involved. Not because the other person came in and took away what they had. It's because the other person was giving the woman what she was not receiving. So he gave and he gave and he gave, and that turned into a relationship. And now it's, okay, I'm going to leave your ass because I'm not getting it from you, and I have somebody that I can lean on right now. That is most of the cases.
By this point, I didn't have any faith in men anymore. Not that I would suddenly become a lesbian.
I get that, but I
needed to be myself.
I'm talking to you about most of the guys that are coming in right now.
Right.
And that are sharing why they're getting divorced, or they're in the process of getting divorced, or their wife is totally acting differently now.
Right.
And there is an understanding of the blowing up of the pit that we don't get. When your pit blows up, when you actually said, when you're watering the water, that's you at the edge of the pit, like just putting the fire on dynamite, and the next thing is like you don't understand it. But it's not the birth, it's not the hormones. All those is at the surface. Is everything that has been filled up. And we, men, put a logical label around that reaction. Must be hormonal, or hey, this and that.
In that pregnancy too, I did hypnobabies, so a form of hypnobirthing and everything, so that I could take more ownership of the birthing process itself. Like I had a birth plan. The other two, we had at the same hospital, same actual nurse that was attending. That was kind of fun. But Chris couldn't understand that, well, this worked for the other two, and I had, the epidural and everything.
Yes.
Why are you wanting to do anything different? And it was this gleam in, like, when we found out we were pregnant with Liam, Chris was really excited, but our communication was in such a shitty place that I had to take ownership of myself again. And what better way than through creating a life, having incubating a life within me. And it's a very sacred experience for me, and so it brought out this divine within me, that I'm worth more than what I was giving myself credit for, and that my mind can do more than what I was giving myself credit for. So I discovered that with Liam, that even though I got an intrathecal towards the end, it was the birthing process itself that taught me a lot of that. Even if Chris isn't going to take care of me, I can take care of myself. And I can take care of the kids.
Talk about the power that you feel in that statement, knowing that you've gone through the pain, that what you just described on this podcast as well, and what you will recall, the pain of life, the pain of I can't, the pain of blowing up, the pain of the empty shelf, the pain of, on the other side, Chris coming to
I was taught
that
men are supposed to take care of women. I'm supposed to be a damsel in distress. And yet here was a man that was, in that position of like, I take care of everybody kind of thing. But then it was this like, but no, who's going to take care of me? And then that's when I realized like, oh, I need to take care of me.
Yes.
And it took a few years because I had channeled that into my children, making sure that they were taken care of. But then with the pregnancy of our fourth child in 2012, that's when I had the empty shell syndrome. I actually had postpartum depression from my third one. Later on, it was a postpartum depression, so it wasn't properly diagnosed and taken care of.
Or maybe it wasn't at all.
It may not have been. It was the pit that I needed to go into to get to the point that I needed to be.
Yes. Talk about the power. Talk about the power that comes in through this experience that you are now projecting on your children. Because here's what you did. You basically broke free of a culture that was actually molding you to fail in your marriage and in your motherhood. That whatever culture, I'm not talking about religion, but the culture that was behind you for years was pushing you. And that's what this story is telling, is that you broke free from this culture that was pushing you to fail, not to win. And today, obviously, Chris came into Warrior X. He went through his pit, and Chris is a great guy, but he needed to be slapped around as well to figure out what the reality is. And he came back in, living the Warrior's way. You come back defeating alone, not with Chris. Let's make that very clear. Defeating alone the culture barrier, finding light on the other side, now shining on your kids. Talk to us about the power of projecting and making sure that you're actually you're projecting this on your kids. How do you feel?
So this is the thing. I wasn't alone. I'm a mother. And so it was through motherhood that I was able to find that strength. And they are truly my greatest accomplishment. They always will be. And in 2012, my youngest Riker went on that journey with me of letting me become who I was meant to become. He decided his name. Riker means strong power. It's Danish, and we are descended from Vikings. And he decided his name that I knew that it needed to have an R in it, and so he decided that when he was about 6 months along in the womb, kicking when I was looking at names and everything. And so I'm like, okay, I guess this is the name for you. And he came. I gave birth to him standing up, holding on to Chris's arms. And I could not have done it without Chris. So when you look at the birth of Liam, my protector, I was by myself. Even though Chris was in the room, I was by myself. But with the birth of Riker, this strong power, I was holding on to Chris's arms while I was standing, and the midwife behind us that was on call because our doctors didn't get there in time, she basically was just there to catch him, and the peace that exuded from Riker, I mean, it was like this post-birth honeymoon that we rode for months and months later. And he's now a heathen, a complete heathen, but his personality has never been tainted by the pain that we had from ourselves, because he was able to help me get through that myself, in seeing that after he was born, I literally knew that I could do anything, that I really could. I can do absolutely anything. If I can give birth to 4 children, and especially that last one, being so empowered, and each of my pregnancies and births were incredible experiences and learning opportunities, but it's the motherhood that has taught me that I truly can do anything.
It's beautiful, because I'm sitting here thinking about there is a unique relationship between man and woman. I mean, I'm just thinking about the birth process, that at the end of the day, life is given to a man by a woman. I mean, you can sit here and you can go into the fucking biology of the sperm and this and that, but life is given to a man by a woman to begin with.
And that's, I think, why Joseph Campbell patterned the hero's journey to always end with a woman. Any journey, journey that's there.
I don't know who the fuck Joseph Campbell is, but here's what I know. Here's what I know. It's if the alpha comes from a woman, right? And I'm sitting here, I'm listening to your story, and first there's this wife, and the wife turns into a mother, and the transition between the level of power that I felt from wife to mother, it's exponential. Here's a wife, here's a mother, which is completely to me, it's like the absolute power. I mean, I'm thinking about my mom, and I'm thinking about any dude's mom. They were a wife at one point. But there is a transition of power that happens between being a fucking wife and mom.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because Chris wanted to have children right off, like within months after we got married. And I said, well, I want to learn how to be a wife first. So I was actually the one, as much as I always wanted to be a mom. That's what they'd ask you at school when you were really little, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm like, I want to be a mom. They're like, okay, what else do you want to be? A mom and an archaeologist like Indiana Jones, if that's possible, but a female version.
Yeah.
And a mom. And so yet, here's a husband that's all on board. He was so excited each pregnancy that we would have. We always wanted 4 kids. And yet I wanted to postpone because I wanted to learn how to be a wife first, because I think that deep down I knew that once I became a mom, it was eternal, and it's something that would forever change me, even though I had not become a mom first. Like, that was eye-opening. Going from 0 to 1 by far was the hardest transition with motherhood than going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4.
The idea of have a relationship with a man, one-on-one relationship with a man, that is your husband, creates a pit like anybody else have a pit. But then there's the idea of a relationship with boys. Boys, you're not girls, but boys specifically, and your boys will create another pit over time as they grow up. So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about a woman's pit. If you're a woman and you're married and you have boys, then you gotta have a dual pit.
I hadn't thought about that.
I mean, some would say, well, hey, I'm a dad, and yeah, you're a dad, but like the kids never actually came out of your body.
Yeah.
There is a transition of power that takes place between being a mom and between being a wife and a mom. And once you're a mom, if you're a mom to a boy, because we're talking about men, this is a men's fucking show. If you're mom to a boy, then there's the beginning of that pit that starts, because there's another relationship between you and another alpha. So we will have one female in our lives, and we could have daughters, and that's fine. But you will actually have multiple alphas in your life, your husband and as well as the boys. There's a difference between, and you know this a little bit more from history, than alphas and I mean, I think in this space, in this time, we're uncovering so much more about women and so much more about our wives and the moms and the moms to our kids. Like, this is a complex fucking maze.
Yeah.
If we haven't figured out our own pit, we don't even have the tools and the right to even try to understand the pit. Because sitting down and understanding all this shit will be at the surface level, but really navigating through the maze of your pit as a husband that wants to go through that, like, dude, you're gonna have to know what the fuck the pit is yourself.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, and I didn't even make this connection until just now, that I had done an essay on my children's birth stories, and within that, for my own sake, because I realized that there were great lessons to learn in each of those birth stories because they were all so different. And in that essay, this was in 2016, I realized that I had 4 warrior weeks. One on May 19th, 2006, one on May 5th, 2008, one on June 24th, 2010, one in November 17th, 2012. And each of those warrior weeks taught me something about myself because of motherhood.
So you're fucking qualified to be sitting here. You're a graduate of 4 warrior weeks. And that's what God wanted you to be here. Because if you're not a graduate of warrior week, you won't really have a seat here. And for you to find that space and that time, it's beautiful. It's actually very powerful that you said that. And if you would have a message for the wife of all the men that are listening right now on the podcast, and just getting a perspective from a wife, from a mother perspective, and you've seen hundreds of our men going through their pit with their wives, and you've heard thousands of stories of separation and liberation and distances and all kind of issues that is happening between a wife and a woman based on really like nothing at the end of the day, right? This unnecessarily gap that takes place and that is fueled by lies. If you would have a message to the wives, not to the guys, but if you would have a message to the wives, like, what would you say? What would you say to invite them through a process of their own warrior week? What would you say to invite them to a process of discovering things that you've discovered, the transition between a wife to a mom, the power that you gain from that pain, and what you're doing today with that?
Oh, I love that question. So when Chris did Warrior X, I got super jealous. Part of it was because I was part of Warrior for a whole year and a half, and yet here's my husband doing a Warrior live event and that I couldn't do. And so I went and started looking for myself, my own program, which I've now, started developing my own takes and everything else. But to not try to be your husband, because let him do his job. You do your job. You do you. And when I learned that Warrior, I don't like wearing black. That's something that I still battle these guys about all the time. That's why I'm wearing a denim jacket over a shirt that I've like even cut and everything else that because I love color. And so a program that I was in, it was talking about this female approach to becoming a better person, and it had all these color examples, and so I would just fell in love with that. And so when I realized what it is that I like about me rather than trying to fix my husband, I realized that he wasn't trying to fix me either. Wow. And because that's the thing, husbands are always trying to find a solution, and the worst thing that they could do is try to like offer a solution to their wife, when we truly want to be supported, and we want to be in a safe enough place that we can feel worthy enough to find that support within ourselves. So many women are taught that it's all about their man, it's all about everybody else, about their children and everything, that when it comes to how to help a wife, don't fix her, just like you don't want her to fix you. Support her, help her feel comfortable enough in her own skin so that then she can find something that works for her. That's the thing about women. We're all different. So my pit is going to be completely different than another woman's pit. My approach to motherhood is completely different to anybody else's, even my mom's. And I love my mom, and I love her example that she gave me. But I've also learned that through Warrior, there are certain things in my life that I have done and continue to do that are true to myself that she doesn't agree with, and it's okay. It was a huge eye-opener for me. It was literally, I was in my 20s that I realized that my mom wasn't perfect. Like, because to me, she always was. I knew my dad wasn't perfect, but my mom was always perfect because she had to put up with my dad, because she had to put up with all these things, and she sacrificed herself. And so it's like, well, that's what an ideal woman is supposed to do. Until I discovered that I can be me, and that's okay, and that I am enough, and that I matter. That was the biggest insight that I had just recently when I went to the last Warrior event in Orlando. We had a small mastermind there, and it was this eye-opening experience that I matter. And it wasn't because I was given permission by anybody but myself, and my husband supported me. He sacrificed his career so that I can be who I am now. I don't know what can be a stronger alpha. What can be a stronger man than someone that is willing to sacrifice his own career so that his wife can become better? And so in that way, my husband has gone through his own warrior weeks in becoming a stay-at-home parent now. And it hasn't been easy. And he's home right now with the kids, so I can be here. And it's hard, but I have a picture from my daughter saying that she loves me, that I'm the best mom ever. And another picture from my youngest son, the heathen, Riker, that has a heart in the shape of one of his eyes, because he knows that I love him and he loves me. And there's no greater gift that anybody could give anybody else.
Beautiful. Beautiful share. And really the message that you can take from this and discuss with your wife tonight, today, this afternoon, whenever the fuck you're listening to this podcast or you're watching this, is the following. Is that you can communicate the three messages that Natalie just dropped here for all of you guys, and that is, you can tell your wife that she's enough, that she can be herself, and that she matters. And in that conversation, you can open up conversation and support her in however she sees herself. And just like Chris is doing currently with Natalie, to walk away from a career of 15 years of being a police officer, living the alpha life, right? And to be at home to watch the kids requires a lot of courage. People think that courage is always found on the front of the battle, but they don't see the courage that is required on the back side. The courage that moms and wives go through every single day in order to make sure that we actually be in the front line. And in this case, Chris reversing that and being there. Ultimately giving us an example and a view in a life of a relationship that matters. At the end of the day, your relationship with Chris matters, and that's why it's working. Any relationship would see his up and down, and we've heard your story in the dark period of your relationship and what brought your relationship together and how you operate today. But ultimately, it becomes a choice. It becomes a choice for you to either accept, to fight through this and fight for the people that you actually give a fuck and care, or simply accept a comfort zone in which you're in right now and life is good. Because to wanting a life that is great, you're living a great life right now. You're living a life that is great. You're living a life of prosperity. You're living a life where your light is shining upon your children, not your darkness. Roll back 10 years ago with the can't, that's exactly what would have been projected on your children. As good as mothers you would have been, you couldn't hide that. That energy is something you can't hide. Mm-hmm. You can't hide your pain. You can't. Mm-hmm. Children would just absorb it because they are children. They are exactly that. They mirror your energy. And so for you to be in that place and to have you on this podcast and share this with the audience, and as well as perhaps maybe women that are listening to this. And if you're a guy that actually took something away from this conversation, and that this is a podcast that you want to share with your wife and say, hey, listen, honey, let's just listen to this podcast. I think it opens up a lot of conversations for you and I to start talking about some shit. If you're the kind of guy that can barely talk to your fucking wife, but you want to talk about shit that we talked about here. You want to talk about her pain. You want to talk about her sexual desires. You want to talk about the power play. You want to talk about her pit. And you can't find the words to fucking communicate, use this podcast. Invite her to listen to this podcast. And inside of this podcast, take what you want to take from it. Take what serves you. Even if this serves you to open up on one conversation that you wouldn't in the past. And now you can see you and your wife crying maybe around a topic that was held inside of you guys for years. Allow this podcast to be the enabler, the catalyst of a relationship that you always wanted. And if you do, go ahead and share it with somebody else that could benefit from this as well. You can find out more about these episodes on warriorweeknow.com. You can also go to iTunes and as well as Google Play to subscribe to the Warrior Week podcast, Parables from the Pit. I want to thank our guests for being here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for changing lives of thousands of men through your writing and through your soul and your heart that you put in this. But also thank you for just being you.
Thank you.
Enough.
Thank you.
All right. Gentlemen, have yourself a fantastic day.